Right, so yesterday it finally happened. After months of waiting, legal hold-ups, and even threats against the court itself, the International Criminal Court finally issued those arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, his former Defence Secretary Yoav Gallant, and the Hamas leader Mohammed Dief for crimes against humanity for committing war crimes. They are now wanted men. And where it is unknown right now if Dief is still even alive, the two other Hamas leaders originally named by the ICC in relation to potential arrest warrants certainly are not. Netanyahu and Gallant most certainly are, and are furious in the least surprising manner they possibly could be. For some, this news will be greeted with hope and optimism that these men will be arrested, will face a reckoning, will have their day in court. For others, they may be looking at this and shrugging their shoulders, thinking as if that is ever going to happen. But in both cases, you'll be missing the bigger issue that these warrants demonstrate, of the real damage to the Israeli government's reputation. And you only need to look at some of the reactions around the world to this news as well to realise that this really does matter. Just not necessarily in the way perhaps you might think it does. Hell's teeth, folks! This story's too big to begin with a right so, and there's a lot to unpack in what has happened. But the big headline is that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant and Mohammed Dief, the last thought to still be surviving Hamas leader originally named by the ICC. The other two now deceased being Yahya Sinwar, recently killed fighting in Rafah, and Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in Tehran back in July, and which elicited in part the second Iranian strike on Israel back at the beginning of October. So I think it is worth remembering that the ICC actually named 3 Hamas leaders originally to issue arrest warrants against, to 2 Israeli ones, in light of Israel's response to all of this. One of the final hurdles to these arrest warrants being issued was the legal challenge by Israel, citing that the ICC did not have jurisdiction to issue them to Israel because Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. It therefore does not recognise the ICC itself. However, this got rejected, which led to the issuing of the arrest warrants, and it is worth drawing attention to the foolishness in their legal challenge. Having challenged the court on Article 19.1 and 19.2 of the Rome Statute, which basically said that the ICC had no jurisdiction to make rulings in relation to Israel, only to be informed that not only is it for the court itself to decide jurisdiction, and with the State of Palestine very much being a signatory to the Rome Statute, they ruled that they absolutely did have the jurisdiction. But also that any opposition to this can only actually be undertaken once arrest warrants were issued. So Israel, in its indignation, actually jumped the gun and went too early. And even more hilariously, under Article 19.4, it states that challenges to admissibility can only be done once. So by going too early, Israel may not now be able to challenge this even now the arrest warrants have been issued. As you can imagine, with the world having fallen out of his backside, Benjamin Netanyahu had a thing or two to say about all of this, and he took to Twitter to vent his spleen, saying, "The anti-Semitic decision of the International Criminal Court is a modern Dreyfus trial and will end the same way. Israel utterly rejects the false and absurd charges of the International Criminal Court, a biased and discriminatory political body. The decision to issue an arrest warrant against the Prime Minister was made by a corrupt chief prosecutor who was trying to save himself from sexual harassment accusations and biased judges who are motivated by anti-Semitic hatred of Israel. The ICC prosecutor lied when he told American senators that he would take no action until he had visited Israel and heard its side. Instead, he cancelled his arrival in Israel last May, several days after suspicions of sexual harassment were made against him, and announced his intention to issue arrest warrants against the Prime Minister and former Defence Minister. No anti-Israel decision will prevent the State of Israel from defending its citizens. Prime Minister Netanyahu will not give in to pressure. He will continue to pursue all the objectives that Israel set out to achieve in its just war against Hamas and the Iranian axis of terror." Oh, the hypocrisy of accusing the chief prosecutor of trying to avoid a day in court himself by issuing these arrest warrants, when Netanyahu has been dodging corruption charges now for 4 years. But there is so much more to unpack here. The International Court of Justice is now anti-Semitic. First point, most important point that the office of the Israeli Prime Minister Twitter account had to make there on behalf of Netanyahu. We know it's coming from Netanyahu himself. Get the victimization out, because of course that's exactly what this is going to be. And this was always going to be Bibi's first reaction, wasn't it? The fact 3 Hamas leaders were also named in the original filing, and this wasn't solely against Israeli leaders, ought to be enough to detonate that. But if you look at ICC Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan's actions before he went to the court to request these warrants, it undermines Netanyahu's excuses here even more. You see, when Karim Khan first mooted this prosecution against the likes of Netanyahu and Gallant and those 3 Hamas leaders, he consulted with 6 legal experts first. And these experts even penned a joint statement which was published in the Financial Times back in May, titled "Why We Support ICC Prosecutions for Crimes in Israel and Gaza." You might recall there was a small bit of media fallout concerning the wife of Hollywood actor George Clooney, the renowned barrister Amal Clooney, for not calling out what Israel was doing at that time. But the truth was she was working with the ICC on building this case, which resulted in this now successful issuing of arrest warrants. She was one of these 6 people. The others were Lord Justice Fulford, himself formerly an ICC judge, Elizabeth Wilmshurst, the former Deputy Legal Advisor to the UK Foreign Office, barristers Baroness Helena Kennedy and Danny Friedman, himself Jewish, and one other, the visiting professor to the University of Oxford and also Jewish, Judge Theodore Meron. Meron I want to talk about briefly because this guy is a literal Holocaust survivor. 94 years old now, former advisor to the Israeli ambassador to the UN, so certainly not anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, and a former judge on the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and Yugoslavia. So definitely a guy who knows genocide when he sees it, arguably better than anyone alive, in fact. And he said there is a criminal case to be made against Benjamin Netanyahu. So if Israel or anyone else want to play that anti-Semite card, point them to Theodore Meron and silence them. Netanyahu also mentioned the Dreyfus trial. This was a false accusation of a Jewish man in France in 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, who was convicted of treason, accused of passing state secrets to Germany, and when it came to light the real culprit was a Catholic, it became widely seen as persecution of a Jewish man for being Jewish. His case was used in no small part by Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism and the main architect for the creation of the State of Israel. Netanyahu comparing himself to Dreyfus, therefore, is frankly a sick joke. The judges are anti-Semitic, though. Khan is just trying to get himself off sexual harassment allegations, which weren't even made until after these warrants were, well, the process to seek these warrants was sought. And although due process should absolutely take its course on that, cannot possibly be linked to it, though, and are widely suspected to be politically motivated themselves. And as for cancelling his visit to Israel in May, Khan had already visited Israel the previous December. Perhaps he'd just seen enough. As for dragging the US into his rantings, well, that just goes to show how rattled the ICC have made Netanyahu. The US has already rejected the arrest warrants. They were always going to. Like Israel, the US doesn't recognise the Rome Statute either, and are now therefore likely to move to sanction the ICC, Karim Khan, the ICC judges and their families as well, all showing what they think of international law and showing who the real terrorists in the world actually are, and all for Israel's sake. By rights, this should isolate the US from those nations signed up to the Rome Statute even more, but probably won't. It's what they've been threatening up till now, though. I see no reason for them to do what they're best at and follow their own selfish, likely bought and paid for interests, regardless going forwards. These are, of course, however, in the US, though, the same politicians who welcomed Netanyahu to Congress to speak to them, aren't they? And shook his hand and took selfies with him. So the ICC, in my view, by rights, should be coming for them next, especially the likes of Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken. Imagine if Netanyahu goes to the US again, though, in light of these arrest warrants, just because the US doesn't recognise them. Such a visit would surely trigger massive protests to reject his presence. Plenty of American commentators are commentating today on how fantastic a result this is, even though their own nation doesn't recognise the ruling. But both sides of the US political house crying foul at the ICC just goes to show how in hoc to the Israel lobby far too many US politicians are, be they Democrats or Republicans, and how corrupt they are in turn. Just look at the bill they recently passed declaring anti-Zionism to equate anti-Semitism. They've just put it into law. It does not equal that at all. It's a racist notion to think that. And it is just an excuse to clamp down on free speech and showing zero sign that the US will walk back in any meaningful way on its support for a genocidal apartheid regime. Equally, when the US does censure the ICC, as I'm sure they will, and those working there, where do they go from there should arrest warrants be applied to US figures following that? I doubt they've thought that through, though. Fundamentally, though, Netanyahu, Gallant, or indeed Mohammed Dief are unlikely to ever be arrested, because they can only be arrested should they set foot in a nation signed up to the Rome Statute, and simply not going to any will avoid that possibility. Netanyahu won't be arrested. He won't go to trial. Perhaps Israel would dispose of him themselves at some point when it suits them or when they're able to, especially if he loses the next election. That's a to be seen event, though. But because he will avoid any nation that says they will arrest him, it's not going to happen anytime soon. But that isn't the point. No nation signed up to the Rome Statute has any excuse following this action to excuse Israel any further. Continuing to work with or aiding Israel, knowing their leader, their prime minister, is wanted, accused of crimes against humanity. And all of these countries have their own legal frameworks, which will include and make allowance for ICC rulings and actions, such as the issuing of warrants. And it's not like they've had to wait until the ICC even did this to take action themselves anyway. In some cases, nations able to think for themselves have already done so, such as Spain or Ireland. Whilst we look here at the UK, perhaps, whilst Keir Starmer and David Lammy are certainly keeping their heads down still in relation to what they will do in light of these arrest warrants being issued, widely expected, I think, to ignore any such request should Netanyahu come here. One Rome Statute signatory has already said they will not enforce this ruling, and that is Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has already invited Netanyahu to come visit. So it's worth considering for a moment the consequences of Rome Statute signatory nations ignoring these arrest warrants. The ICC could bring legal action against Hungary, for one, for not fulfilling its duties and obligations as a Rome Statute signatory. That's a basic start. The ICC can also refer an offending state to the UN Security Council for censure. If this were to be done to Hungary, you can be assured the US would veto any sanction over this, though. But there can be political and economic ramifications too. The Rome Statute is tied to EU law, so Hungary could find itself in a whole world of legal trouble with other European nations off the back of this proclamation. And the same goes for the UK if Starmer and co keep avoiding saying they will abide by international law. But I'm keeping their responses for another video. It's bad news for Netanyahu. It is the worst news for Israel, because for as much as public opinion has soured against Israel significantly for the last 13 months, international law, both at the ICJ with their investigation into a plausible case of genocide, and now the ICC against both Netanyahu and Gallant personally, back that up in law. We're in the right to oppose what Israel is doing. Legal due process is telling us that now. International law says so. And any rhetoric to the contrary from any politicians anywhere is now even more unforgivable and probably illegal. Meanwhile, where Israel are also making accusations against Iran over the matter of nuclear weapons, just to divert and digress a little bit, the Iranians have come back playing a rather clever political game with this, having flipped the script on such notions of nukes back on the blue and white state itself, apparently the only state in the Middle East to actually have these things, causing yet another headache for Netanyahu and co. Do check out the mess Israel have got themselves in there in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.